Alright everybody, thanks for tuning in to my video. We're back here again with the Honda scooter project. This is I'm going to call it the power unit because it comes with basically your bottom end casting where this holds your whole crank assembly, and the top jug goes onto here. I just kind of wanted to show you a little bit of what I had done. I had actually poured it out this area a little bit. It looks kind of rough. I don't have the right tool to get in there to really get it super smooth, make it look like someone with a professional way did it, but I opened it up a little here, kind of smooth that ramp, smoothed any of the transitions where the metal casting was, took all the sharp edges off, tried to make this little center bridge here a little thinner on each edge while keeping it still stationary in the center for a little bit of structural strength. The issue I have now is finding the correct seal. So the seals are kind of hard to get the correct size. I can get, I think, the big one from Napa, but the small one's hard to find. So it is what it is. But I've got an issue, not really an issue, but it is what it is. When I was trying to get this apart and I couldn't get the bearings out, I actually took a putty knife and went in here and pushed it through all the areas where there weren't a dowel pin, and you can kind of see some scarring on there. It's not very deep at all, but what I did, I basically took some 400 and 600 grit sandpaper and glued it down to the table, and took this and laid it flat and rubbed it back and forth a few times, keeping even pressure on it and supporting the other end to where it didn't rock back. But I basically tried to sand that back smooth at just a little bit, not enough to where like a lot of shavings were left over or anything like that, because you take too much metal, these two pieces sit too far into one another and you don't want it to be squeezing on your crank or anything like that. So I did the same thing with this one. I removed the dowel pins and I went ahead and tried to smooth the surface of this, and I've got to clean it really well with brake cleaner, and then put the Honda Bond. I'm actually not using Honda Bond. I am using Permatex, which is the gray Permatex. I've had great luck with that. I don't see it sitting out here on my table, so it's somewhere else right now. But yeah. Okay, so we've got the two cases split apart. You just add heat to the case and use a puller and pull it apart. Now the reason why I'm pulling it apart, I'll show you. Let's see if I can get the camera to focus on it. If you notice the end of the threads, the shaft wobbles ever so slightly. The faster you do it, the more you can tell. You see it. I checked with the micrometer and I believe it's only at around about, I don't know, 7-8 thousandths, but by the time you multiply that by 10,000 or 12,000 RPM, that becomes an extremely unbalanced engine and probably will destroy the crank. So definitely a hard lesson to learn, but we're just going to go ahead and put an Athena Crank in it and some new polini bearings and not worry about it. This time when we put it together, I'll know a little bit more about what I'm doing. I've got the head on and I started to put the bolts in and noticed an issue. When you take the bolt and you put it in the hole, it doesn't go no further than that because the shaft and the shank of the bolt here is just a little bit larger than that hole. I mean, you damn near almost have to thread that in. So I'm going to have to take a drill bit and enlarge that hole. So that's 433.5. And that's 432.5. Alright, so we're going to try this drill bit right here and see what we get with the head. I think what the issue was that the milling, when they milled that down, it was a little bit of overlap. So they just didn't take the edge off. Oh yeah, now it fits. That drops through. That drops through. Alright. Just had to be cleaned up a little. Alright, so it's 11 o'clock at night, it's late, and the bearings are here. Long day, and I'm just kind of getting around to this. So what we've got half of the crank here, the crankcase, and we have got the bearings chilling in the oven right now, and we have the crank chilling wrapped up in the freezer. So take notice, we've got everything ready. We've got our bolts in order, top to bottom, left to right, the spots where they're supposed to go. Got the WD-40 to release and remove any of the condensation that could be present in the bearings once they go back in the freezer, once it's put in half the crankcase. And we've got our Permatex and our Loctite and our ratchet for tightening it down. So, and my gloves. So everything is here, everything is ready. And this will be kind of a long process to allow things to heat and cool naturally, but it'll only take a short little while for y'all in the video. So I went ahead and put the other half of the crankcase in the oven. I'm letting the bearings heat up for a little bit longer. I've got it set at 215 degrees right now, and it's at 209, so it's starting to heat up. So the idea behind this is the bearings, when they get hot, they're going to expand. The crankshaft is chilling in the freezer. When the crank gets colder, the metal is going to contract. So if the bearings expand and the crank contracts, the bearings will now slide over the shaft instead of having to press them on and worrying about bending the crankshaft. Okay, so it's been 30 minutes. We're gonna go ahead and take the crank out of the freezer. Don't want our oils in our hands touching the metal to where we don't have it rust or contaminate it or get any moisture. Now that the bearings are hot, we're going to take it, place it right over the shaft. Okay, so it's like 1 o'clock in the morning, and putting the crankshaft bearings on were a little bit harder than I thought. So take two. I've got the bearings back in the oven and the crank back in the freezer, and I've turned the heat up in the oven to 275 degrees, and I'm gonna let the crank sit in the oven for about an hour. Make sure that it is completely chilled all the way to the core, to at least 20 degrees, whatever the freezer gets to. And that way we know that the crank is contracted as much as possible and the bearings are heated up at least another 75 degrees than what they were, to where they can expand a little bit more. Because I could get one of them on 80% of the way, but I decided not to because the other one didn't want to slide at all. So we're going to try this again. Bear with me. The crank has been in the freezer overnight. And the bearings have been in the toaster oven at 275 degrees, close to 300 for about 15 minutes or longer. So we're going to try to take the bearings and slide them over the shaft and see what happens. We're going to take the crank out of the bag. It's nice and cold. We're going to hold it with this hand. We're going to grab the hot bearing, take the letters, face them out, drop it right over the shaft. I've got a piece of PVC pipe here cut. We're going to take it, tap that. That's on there. Spins nice and true, nice and free. We're going to take the other one. We're going to hold that. Take this bearing, if I can pick it up, we're going to slide it over the shaft. That falls on perfectly. So, now that we have both bearings on the crank, I'm going to recommend that the crankshaft itself stays in the freezer overnight. That way it thoroughly gets cooled all the way to its core to where you get maximum contraction out of the metal. And the bearings at least need to stay at 275 to 300 degrees for at least 15 minutes. Could be 20 minutes, but that way the bearings expand as much as possible. Because this shaft right here is definitely the same size as the inside of that bearing. So once it's on there, it does not come off. So this is all ready to go back in the freezer. So what's going to happen now is the crank's going to go back in the freezer with the bearings. But before that, I'm going to let it sit out about 30 minutes and let it cool naturally before I send the bearings that are 300 degrees back into a 0-degree environment. So after the crank goes back in the freezer, this is going to go in the oven. This is going to get heated. That will expand where the bearing is going to go, and then I'll go ahead and I'll drop this in its spot. So I went ahead and labeled the bolts. I've got TL and TR for top left and top right. Then I've got them in sequential 1, 2, 3, and 4. That way I can't mess them up, because the hole on the other side of the crankcase for, I believe it's this bolt here, the hole is actually, I think, 20 or 30 thousandths shallower. So you can tighten the bolt, but the bolt will actually bottom out 1.5 threads before that bolt is tightening this case against the other one. So you'll think it's tightening it, but it's really not. So that's very important to get that right. See, with the bolts out, we've got, this would be your top right, that would be your top left. That is 1, 2, 3, and 4. So this one right here, we've got, it looks about 3 or 4 threads extra in length. But if you look at all of your holes, none of them are different. So that is it's a big deal when it comes to this. So you want to make sure you get your bolts in the right hole. So we're going to take the crankcase out of the oven, put it in there at 270 degrees for about 25 minutes. We're going to drop this right in. Oh man, that fits perfect. That just drops right in. That does so good. So basically, the contracted bearings and the expanded crankcase allows for easy installation. And then take the other half of the crankcase, heat that up, and then when we take this section out of the freezer, since right now it's 200 and some degrees, we can't put the Permatex on that area right there. So we're gonna have it cold to where the bearing is cold, and we're gonna heat the other crankcase and put our Permatex on this. So this will be, you know, roughly 20 degrees or 10 degrees, whatever the freezer is, and then the other side will be 270. And then we'll have our bolts ready and we'll tighten it in. We're gonna go ahead and open up the freezer. I've got it chilling down here in a bag. Try to protect the bearings. Go ahead and set that right there. Okay, so what we had to do, we had this in the freezer. We had to wait for this to thaw out, so I put this in the oven for about 2 minutes and got all the frost off of it. And I took my paper towel. I cleaned all of this off of here. There's no moisture on it anymore. Now we're going to take our Permatex. We're going to put it all along this. Give you a quick view. So got that. gonna take our other half out the oven over here. I went ahead and wrapped it in aluminum foil that way. The seals, the rubber seals, didn't get melted. I tried to prevent that anyways. Okay. Now what we're going to do is put our bolts in, top left, top right. 1, 2, 3, and 4. We can take our PVC pipe. Okay, so the halves are together. Let's make sure it spins. And it spins. Awesome. Now all we gotta do is spray some WD-40 down in there. That way we don't want any of that rusting. See the squish? You come in here, you see that a little bit, and it looks like that all the way down throughout it. So, but all of our numbers, bolts in numerical order. This side and squish. Look underneath. That looks pretty good. Alright. Now all I got to do is clean up all the moisture that's in here so we don't have anything rust.